Cantor hated the forest. It was thick here and steeped in its own silence. Deep in the timber, the quiet was old and indifferent, the silence of a place that had never required human presence, and certainly did not mourn its interruption. The trees rose tall and close on either side of the old road, their canopies dense enough to reduce the morning sky to scattered fragments of pale light. Unbidden, thoughts of dreaded Aidan flooded Cantor's mind, and he could do little but recall his own temptation, his own fall. No Eve for him to curse and blame for his own weakness, just a tiny seed of wanton greed that had grown to become its own thick forest in his soul, as verdant and thick as the trees that surrounded him now. Beneath the high canopy, the Golden Legion moved like a river of dark metal and crimson cloth, in places rusted and pitted, but always unhurried and enormous, the sound of its passing a low and constant percussion of boot and wheel and chain on packed earth. There was no singing on this march. Cantor would not allow it. Not for any tactical reasons, he simply loathed any voice that wasn't his own. Cantor allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction at the force that he had managed to form around himself. The Golden Legion was a brutally efficient fighting force. Everyone on it owned something to Mammon, had made some dark pact with him in a moment of desperation, but it was also disparate, a mosaic of different broken tiles held together by Cantor's will more than anything else. Without his presence and leadership, Melik's vast knowledge of the debt, and the brutal power of Walpurgis to keep the Legion in line, it is likely that they all would have butchered each other long ago. But Cantor also had another tool of control, something that was, in a way, his, and his alone. He could hear the scales before he could see them. They were deployed in a broad flanking formation to the left of the main column, moving through the thicker timber with a noise that had no natural analogues, the crashing and splintering of men too large and too heavily armoured to accommodate the forest, punctuated by the rhythmic clanking of their weapons and the low guttural exchanges that passed for communication between them. It wasn't language, precisely. The Scales hadn't entirely abandoned that concept, but they had long since ceased to use it for anything that required subtlety, and what remained was functional and blunt, the stripped-down vocabulary of men who had traded too much of themselves for the armoured shells that they now inhabited. Cantor turned from the road and walked between the trees towards them. He found them at the edge of a shallow ravine, where a stream cut through the forest floor and the ground fell away in a short, muddy drop. They had stopped here, not from any difficulty with the terrain, but because one of their number had found something in the ravine, and the others had gathered around to watch. The Scales are true soldiers, addicted to war and greedy for things that normal men would never understand. But true soldiers would always grow bored on the march, veteran calm replacing the eager anxieties of younger men. If there was something to stand and watch, the Scales would do just that, and there wasn't anything that anybody could do to hurry them along, except to promise them a fight sooner than they expected to get one. Cantor approached without announcing himself, and stood at the lip of the ravine and looked down. A rider, or what had been a rider. The horse was dead, trapped beneath a fallen rock, and the man had presumably survived the fall, but not whatever had found him afterward. He was still alive, just barely, pinned at the waist and watching the Scales with the fixed, glassy expression of a man whose fear had exhausted itself and left behind little more than a terrible waiting. He had lain at the bottom of the ravine, awaiting death to come and claim him, but what had found him was so much worse. The scale standing over him was enormous. The armor it wore thick and dark and scored with impacts from a multitude of battles. The scales were not worshippers of Mammon, simply in debt to him, and they plied their trade in flesh and blood wherever he commanded. But they hated the Lord of Greed, as did many in the Legion, for only a few of them were there by choice. Everyone else, from Cantor to the War Pig and the Scales, was shackled with a debt that could likely never be paid off. As some petty act of rebellion, the Scales wore little ostentation on their armor, preferring utilitarian plate and brutal weaponry. But they could not escape the simple truth that they were as much slaves to Mammon as everyone else on the march that day. The massive scale crouched over the pinned man, its head tilted, listening to something only it could hear. And Cantor knew what it was listening for. The Scales had been many things before this. Soldiers, mostly, men who had fought under various banners for various causes and accumulated debt in the usual fashion, through the ordinary human mechanism of desperation and poor judgment, and the terrible arithmetic of wanting more than one could honestly acquire. They had all of them come to the side of hell of their own volition, selling a little piece of themselves with each demand made, until eventually they had struck at their grandest deal, and they had marched into the lakes of fire, and their weak flesh had been made strong. They had wanted what all soldiers want, which was the joy of battle, and they had wanted to be the very best, and the way to know the true worth of a man. As they walked into the lake of fire, Mammon had been waiting, and had offered them that way. They could smell it in the air, and it had always led them to the same place. To the brutal heart of the fight, where the siege was fiercest, and the fighting the most intense. They had been forged again and again until they had become what they wanted to be, the very best. But they had owed, and they could not pay, and Mammon's patience had limits that were not always visible until they were crossed. What the Lord of Want had offered them next seemed so familiar to what they really wanted that they couldn't even spot the trap before they had walked into it. They had become, like all things, his creatures not by choice, but through trickery. Their souls acting as collateral in a game where they didn't fully comprehend the rules. The particular gifts of the Scales, beyond their size and their weapons, and their capacity for violence that had exceeded even the considerable violence available to the rest of the Legion, was that they could hear it, the death. Not metaphorically, not as an abstraction of obligation, but literally and precisely. A sound beyond the threshold of ordinary hearing, a frequency seemingly produced by the specific weight of what a man owed, pressing down upon the glass-like fragility of his soul. Every man in debt to Mammon carried this sound within him, the cracks at the edges of the foundations of his soul, and the Scales could sense it on the wind like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Melik hated this about them, Cantor knew. It was one of the few things he had never tried to conceal. The scale reached down and took the pinned man's wrist with a gentleness that was somehow worse than violence would have been, and the man made a sound that was not quite a word in any language. The scale straightened, dragging him from beneath the dead horse, letting go of his arm as he cleared the weight of the corpse. The man had clearly said his own prayers and made his own deal with whatever answered, unthinking and desperate. Cantor assumed that he had prayed to be free of his horse, likely driven to the edge of madness by his own pain and thirst and hunger. and Mammon had been there to answer. And so he was free, but his soul was forfeit. And Cantor turned and walked away as the scale raised its foot, bringing it crashing down onto the man's head. The death was logged, not in any book. The scales would carry it in their bodies, in the dense and complicated musculature beneath the armor, in whatever had replaced the ordinary interior life of the men they had been. Each soul they collected from Ammon's vault lightened them by some infinitesimal fraction that would never be enough. The weight of their own debt simply too vast and too permanent to be reduced by any quantity of collection. This was, as with so many of Mammon's arrangements, the point. The debt could never be repaid faster than it was accrued. Behind him, the scales resumed their movement through the trees, the crashing and clanking picking up its irregular rhythm, and Cantor felt the particular satisfaction of machinery functioning as it was designed to. He had built the scales from the materials available to him, as he had built everything in the Legion, and the elegance of a system in which the collectors were themselves the collected had not diminished for him over the long years of its operation. It remained one of his finer pieces of work. He was not embarrassed to think so. He had been told to build an army, and an army he had built. He rejoined the road and walked on, and the forest continued around him indifferent and vast, the trees continuing to press close on either side, the light coming down in thin and scattered columns that moved across the road as the canopy shifted in the gentle winds above. Melik appeared at his shoulder with his customary precision, the records rustling softly at his back. They walked in silence for a time, the column moving steadily through the trees around them. Cantor could hear Walpurgis somewhere behind, the deep and rhythmic percussion of his passage distinct from everything else. A sound that you felt in your chest, and that seemed to muffle even your own heartbeat. He was restrained after a fashion, but not chained, which was neither practical nor particularly effective. But he was managed, which was a different thing, requiring a different set of tools and different qualities. The sea was behind them now, and without it, Walpurgis moved through the world with the quality of a fire that had been deprived of air, but not extinguished, still burning inward. How far? Cantor asked. Melik did not consult any records, simply replied, "At current pace, we will clear the forest before nightfall. The ground opens into farmland beyond the tree line, and the fortress sits on a rise above, approximately 2 miles further." Cantor said nothing. "It will be visible from the tree line," Melik added, with the careful neutrality of a man who was not making a point, but was noting a fact that happened to have the same shape as one. They walked on, and the forest began almost imperceptibly to thin. The trees grew further apart, the canopy loosening its hold on the sky, and the light that fell across the road became less fragmented, the pale grey of evening spreading itself across the widening path ahead. The undergrowth eventually gave way. The road broadened. And then, without ceremony, the trees ended, and the world opened up before them into a wide and rolling landscape of harvested fields and low stone walls, and the distant smoke of farmhouses that had already, it seemed, received some advance intelligence of what was coming, and responded accordingly, with emptiness and silence. Cantor stopped at the tree line and looked out across the fields. There, on the rise, precisely where Melik had said it would be, sat the fortress of the Blackened Crown. It was old, built from the same dark stone as the basilica in Biarritz, its walls thick and its towers blunt and practical in the manner of a structure designed by men who understood that beauty was secondary to survival. Where the basilica had been elegant and beautiful, Even in Cantor's eyes, this building was squat and ugly, and promised only death to those who sought to breach its walls. Banners hung from the battlements, the symbol of the blackened crown dark against the pale sky, and Cantor could see, even at this distance, the movement of figures on the walls, the small and distant activity of a garrison that had been warned and was preparing to fight, as if their lives depended on it. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Behind him, the Golden Legion continued to emerge from the trees, spreading out across the field's edge in a line that extended further in both directions than the eye could comfortably follow. The scales taking in their flanking positions, the column breaking into its assault formations, the machinery of it all clicking into place, with the quiet inevitability of a mechanism that had been wound and was now simply running. Somewhere in the middle distance, Walpurgis stopped walking and stood, and a particular quality of his stillness in that moment was the stillness of a creature that had found in the sight of walls and towers and the small figures moving on them a temporary and terrible focus for everything that had nowhere else to go. Melik stood beside Cantor and said nothing, which was, for once, the correct instinct. The banners of the blackened crown moved in the wind above the fortress walls, and Cantor watched them, and the evening light lay cold and even across the fields between them, and the distance that remained was not very great at all.